We've been working our way through Matthew. We're in chapter 5 now. So if you remember, we've been doing this series called The Kingdom of Heaven, a theme throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And then we started a couple weeks ago the Sermon on the Mount. So we've started a series within the series that's titled Kingdom Life. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is describing what does life look like in the kingdom. We spent a couple weeks kind of looking at big picture and then diving into the Beatitudes and what it looks like to have a flourishing life within the kingdom. And we're going to continue with roots in that into the next part of what Jesus leads into. Whether you want to admit it or not, every single person is a walking billboard. All of us end up with our language, with our words, we all end up promoting what we think makes people the most happy. Right? So it could be you found a new restaurant. That was a quite enjoyable experience. What do? You tell others about it. Some of you wear quite proudly the brand of tractor that you would prefer, right? And you have no problem speaking about such things. Or for some of you, it may be a preference of what company you buy your gun from, who produces the guns that you shoot. Or some of you might be a specific grocery store that you go to and you talk highly about because of the produce that place has. Right? All of this to say, if we're experiencing some sort of pleasure, some sort of happiness with something, we often speak about it. And that brings us to our text this morning, which is a popular but often misused text, where Jesus tells us, you are the light of the world. And we often link this, this passage often gets pulled out of its context, and it's just like, light of the world. Okay, yeah, just be kind, be a nice person, do good things. But today, hopefully, as we work through it, you're going to see that being the light of the world isn't just being nice, but it has roots in the Beatitudes themselves of being the light of the world is actually putting on display what it means to truly flourish in life. And as we experiencing that flourishing in Christ, we now want others to taste and see that flourishing. So we're in Matthew chapter 5. We're going to start at the back end of the Beatitudes just to keep the context here for us. So we're going to start in verse 10 and go through verse 16. Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Now, as I said, often these words of being the light of the world are assumed to mean having some sort of charitable personality, charitable attitude, to being polite to people. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't include that, but I'm saying, is that all it means? Right? And I think what we see here is you actually can't divorce being the light of the world or the salt of the earth. You can't divorce that from the Beatitudes. In fact, I would say being salt of the earth and light of the world is actually being the flourishing, the blessed person from the Beatitudes. Notice, what do we begin with the salt of the earth? Verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. Who's the you? Right? Is Jesus just saying anybody who wants to be? Or we just saw in the verse before, that's why I included it. What do we see in verse 11? Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you. And then the you are those who rejoice and be glad for the reward that's great in heaven while they are being persecuted. Right? So the you here of you are the salt of the earth is not just those who try to be kind. The you is you who are being persecuted for living the flourishing life. Those are the people who are the salt of the earth. Those are the people who are the light of the world. So it goes much deeper than just try to get along with others. Rather, it's those who have found what it means to flourish and are trying to live that out, even when others are rejecting them for trying to live it out. To be salt and light is to rejoice and be glad even when other people are reviling you. The happy life distinguishes us from the rest of the world. And really, we could tap on something else here for a moment that I think might be helpful. We ought to see flourishing as simply just being gospel life. Right? Sometimes I think we read the Beatitudes and we're like, man, this seems like additional rules for the Christian to live out on top of everything else that we're commanded to do in the rest of Scripture. But really, I want us to think of the gospel as a diamond for a moment. And when light hits the diamond, right, depending on the angle in which it hits it, the light looks different, right, as it reflects out. So think of the gospel as a diamond, and Jesus giving the Beatitudes is just one angle of light shining on the diamond of the gospel of what it looks like. Jesus is speaking about it with wisdom language, right, with virtuous type of language in the Beatitudes, but he's really just describing what it looks like for someone to live out the gospel. Right? This is really no different from a lot of other things. Just think about it for a moment. You hear the word poor in spirit, those who mourn their sin, those who are meek. It sounds awfully similar to what we hear in James chapter 4 about those who are humble themselves and those who grieve their sin. It's not all that different. This is gospel living. Or you hear someone who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. Sounds awfully similar to Colossians chapter 3 where it says, seek the things that are above, not the things that are below. Right? So it's not that these are all a bunch of rules, just one being added to another. They're just different angles of hitting the same gospel diamond, describing what does the Christian life look like. So really we could say the Beatitudes aren't more rules, right? Instead, it is everybody who sees their sin, who sees their emptiness, grieves the penalty for our sin, and has believed in Christ's substitution on the cross for our sin. And by faith in him, we have received the Spirit who now helps us to live out that gospel. That's what the Beatitudes are describing, right? It's not any different than gospel life. It's just a different angle on describing it. Or you may describe it from another angle here, and we see a little bit of this show up here, right? We might describe it as you are imitating your Father who is in heaven. I think of salt and light as flourishing, but also think of salt and light as being godly or being Christ-like people. We could think of, in this passage at least, salt of the earth and light of the world are synonyms here, right? They're used in a synonymous type of way. And think of the Old Testament and just the use of the word light in the Old Testament, right? Genesis 1, God says, let there be light. Or God's word in the book of Psalms being described as, right, a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Right, so God is associated, and his word is associated with light throughout the Old Testament. And then in Isaiah 49, God comes and says to his people, I'm going to make you a light of the nations. But Israel fails to be that. Right? They reject Christ when he comes. So now Jesus enters in, and John chapter 8 says what? I am the light of the world. Right? You are to believe in me, to walk in the light that I give. And now we come to the Sermon on the Mountain. Jesus is saying what? Not only is he the light of the world, he says, now you, those who follow me, become the light of the world. Right? So you could think of this as flourishing. You could think of this as gospel living. You could think of this as imitating our Father who is light. But we also ought to think of this with roots in the Old Testament, salt and light, as new covenant kind of language. Both salt and light are linked to covenantal ideas in the Old Testament. I was just reading through it actually this week in Leviticus chapter 2. Did anybody know what was told to Israel that all of their sacrifices were supposed to have? Every one of their sacrifices were supposed to be seasoned with salt. Right? So this is covenantal language. This is the Mosaic covenant, right? God telling Israel, this is how you are to live. This is what your offerings and sacrifices are supposed to look like. And he says, all of them need to have salt within this covenant relationship. Anybody else know? In Exodus 35, 39, as the tabernacle's getting organized, what's one of the central pieces in the tabernacle? A lamp on a lampstand. A light shining centrally in the tabernacle. God's presence, right? So now we have salt and light, both connected to the old Mosaic covenant. Now I want you to hear from Isaiah chapter 42, just real quick, as we begin to hear God talk about a new covenant. Isaiah 42, verse 6. Listen to what God says. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations. You hear that? There's a new covenant coming, and now God's people are going to display that covenant and be the light for the nations, right? So the light is no longer hidden, right, underneath the garments of the tabernacle, right? It's not just in this one specific location. In the new covenant, that light is going to shine forth from God's people who are supposed to be living out this new covenant. And now Jesus arrives and says he's bringing in a kingdom, right, ushering in a kingdom. And here he says those who are part of that kingdom become the salt and the light of the world. So we are supposed to be displaying what it means to be in this new covenant. But we must remember to be salt and to be light are not negotiables. This is not, well, you could be salt and light of the world. Right? To use a Star Wars quote, use the language of Yoda. He tells Luke at one point, do or do not. There is no try. Right? It's either you are salt or you're not. You either are light or you're not. And that's kind of the assumption from this passage, right? As he goes on to describe it, what's he say? If you try to be salt, but you have no saltiness, you're of no use. In fact, you're thrown out and trampled. That's judgment type language, by the way. Or the insane behavior to light a candle and put a basket over top of it. That's absurd to think that anyone would think that's a good idea. And that's his whole point, right? So it's not, well, just maybe if you want to be the salt. Like I said, no, if you're part of the kingdom, you must be salt. You must be light. So we must take from this that one of the things Jesus is trying to get across is the world is supposed to taste and see the flourishing that we are experiencing. The world should be tasting and seeing the flourishing that we experience, not in an arrogant way, right? We're not the Pharisees looking from our ivory tower, frowning upon everybody else, right? It's not that we're so much better than them. Rather, we come to it with humility, with purity. The world should see us resisting self-exaltation. The world should see us resisting self-sufficiency. They should see us seeking after righteousness. They should see us saying, I want to seek after peace in my relationships. They should see us saying, I want to be merciful to the people around me. Think about it for a moment. We all look to the people that we think flourish in a specific area when we have questions about that area, right? So I'll use Ron as an example, right? If I want to have some sort of better understanding about flooring, who am I going to run to? Right? The person who flourishes in that area. So now let's zoom that out, right? We're not talking about an occupation now. We're talking about if someone wants to understand how to flourish in life, what it means to be truly happy in life, who are they going to run to? The people who are acting like those who are flourishing in life. Right? So that's what it means for us to be salt and light. The world should be tasting and seeing us and saying, that's what flourishing looks like. If I have questions about it, that's the person that I'm going to go ask my questions to. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's going to be drawn to the salt and the light. Right? So while we're supposed to be this doesn't guarantee that everybody who sees it is going to be like, oh yeah, that tastes good or that looks good to me. In fact, what we see in these, from the beginning to the end of these verses, is actually as we flourish in life, it actually polarizes the world. Did you catch it? At the beginning, what's the first response, right? So first of all, before we get to the responses, this reminds us that there is a public component to human flourishing. Right? This is not religion. If you want to call this religion, religion is not just a private matter. It's supposed to be public. Right? And that's what the world wants to push us into, right? Just keep it in the privacy of your own home. Don't bring it outdoors, and we'll be fine. We can try to learn to get along with that, but that's not at all what we're being told here. We're told that the world is watching and tasting and seeing our lives, and should be tasting and seeing our lives in such a way that they're going to go in one of two directions. Now, the first direction is what? What we already saw last week in the end of the Beatitudes. Persecution. People are going to hate the salt and the light. People will see you trying to live out the gospel and they will spit on it. People are going to look at your refusal to promote yourself and say, you're a coward. People are going to look at your mourning of sin in yourself and in others around you and say, that's bigoted for you to call that sin. People are going to look at your pursuit of purity, saying, I want to keep myself untainted from the things of the world, and say, you're just a goody two-shoes. People are going to see your attempts at peace and reconciliation and not trying to get revenge and say, that's weak-minded stuff. So, we have to understand, this is a legitimate option. As you publicly flourish in life, people might respond that way. In fact, we'll see later in the sermon, most people respond that way. We're told in Matthew 7, what? Wide is the gate and the path, and many are those who walk on it that lead to destruction. Most of the world is going to look at you that way. So don't be surprised. They did the exact same thing to Jesus, right? And he was the king of the kingdom. Don't be surprised, but also don't doubt your flourishing because you've gotten pushback for it. In fact, if people are pushing back on you trying to live out righteousness, it may actually be proof that you're doing the right thing in the way that Jesus describes it here. And may we not also forget the parable of the soils, that there's two soils in the middle of that parable who initially look like they're receiving the news with joy, but the moment persecution comes, falls away. Those are the same group as the people who persecute, the people who reject it. All three of those soils, right? Those who reject it from the beginning and those who get choked out and have no root, right? All three of those are still in the rejection category. So just because somebody might not be persecuting you from the forefront of things may not mean that they're not in the rejection category. So that's the first category. And then we see the polar opposite response at the end, though, don't we? As you let your light shine, what's it say? That others will see it, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So there is one kind of soil that hears the news, that sees the flourishing and says, I really want that. I really want to experience what true righteousness really looks like. They taste the salt of our lives and say, I hunger for more of that. They look at the light and say, I want more of that. Expose more of me that I might experience that. And it's not just that they believe the gospel, but ultimately those who believe the gospel do what? Give glory to the Father who is in heaven. But we also remember that other part of Matthew 7, right? That gate and that pathway is narrow, and only few enter by it. All this to say, as we seek to be salt and light in this world, we can expect less and less middle ground. And I don't mean that in a hopeless sort of way. I don't mean that in, well, don't try because you're going to find less middle ground. I'm not saying that at all. And I'm not saying it in such a way of, because it's going to be hard to ever find middle ground, that you should just isolate yourself from the rest of the world and hide away, right? That's the exact opposite of this text. But it is just a reminder that nobody is indifferent towards Jesus. Nobody's Switzerland when it comes to Jesus. Nobody pulls back and says, I'll be neutral here. You're either rejecting him or you're giving glory to the Father who is in heaven. As people watch our lives and they taste and see our flourishing, their hearts are either going to be clay or wax. The same sun that shines on wax and clay is the sun that melts, softens the heart of wax, and hardens the heart of clay. Right? So as we flourish, people are going to taste and see it, but they're going to respond only one way or the other. So that leaves the question for us. How do we live as salt and light in this world? Right? Now we get it. What does it mean to be salt and light a little bit? But what does that actually play out like? What should we be focusing on? Because, after all, Jesus does close with a command. Right? Look at his final word in verse 16. In the same way, let your light shine before others. So if that's more than just be polite and be nice, then how do we do this? How do we make sure our light is shining? I want to just hit a couple things here. First of all, we must concentrate on being before our doing. We must concentrate on being salt before we start doing the things that salt does. We must focus on being light before we start doing the things that light does. If you notice, God cares about the posture of your heart. He cares about the wants of your heart before he ever starts describing obedience to you. If we focus only on the things we're supposed to do, we become just like the Pharisees. And you can even do that, though, with being kind. And the Pharisees weren't kind people, right? But we can do that same idea of just doing and apply it to just being kind. So you can be kind to another person and polite to another person, meanwhile having evil thoughts about that person in your head. You go away and you start gossiping about that person. You might be harnessing bitterness towards that person, right? So if you only are focusing on the doing and not the being, you're no different than the Pharisees, who just wash the outside of the cup but never worry about the inside. And we saw this in the Beatitudes, but we also see it this week. If you remember last week in the Beatitudes, what did we see? To be poor in spirit precedes being merciful. You will struggle to give mercy to others if you don't recognize yourself as poor in spirit first. Or a hunger for righteousness precedes being pure in heart. Right? You won't seek purity in life until you actually hunger to be righteous in life. And we even see it today. Before Jesus says, let your light shine, what's he said? Let me give you your identity first. You are salt. You are light. Right? right? Identity, before you even begin to radiate that light, before you let that light shine, let me tell you who you are first. So, what does it mean to, quote unquote, be salt? Now, there's a lot of different thoughts on why salt is used here as the metaphor, right? I obviously think it has something to do with some New Covenant language from the Old Testament, Old Covenants. But some people are like, does this mean that it's a preservative? Does that mean it's a purifier? But I think implied by Jesus' question of if salt has lost its taste, that's what it's supposed to mean. Salt gives a flavor of life, right? All of us, our lives taste a certain way, right? Metaphorically speaking. And so here it says to be salt is to have your life taste like Christ, right? And that's an enriching flavor, right? Salt enhances the flavor of life, right? Or of a food, and flourishing enhances the flavor of life. Now, how do you be salt? Well, first, you must be feeding on Christ if you want your life to taste like his life. You should be feeding on him so that he will change more of you, so that your life will taste more like him. What we feed on is what we end up tasting like, if you really think about it. You know, Lydia and I had tried to introduce our kids to some old TV shows sometimes. And Lydia and I both grew up watching the show Full House. Some of you probably are familiar with that. We had to stop letting our kids watch it because the youngest daughter, right, the Olsen twins, has a word that she likes to say to people as she grows up. She eventually says it quite often in the shows. She'll look at someone and say, duh. Well, guess what happens when your kids feed on that? They start coming to their parents and saying that word, right? What you feed on is what you begin to taste like. So that's what it means to be salt, but we also want to be light. And when we think of light, it's a little more clear than salt, right? Light has an attraction quality to it, right? People can be drawn to light, and it also has an exposure component to it. It pushes away the darkness. So how do you be light? Well, ask yourself first the question, am I attracted to the light? If I don't have any attraction to the light, it's going to be really hard for me to be the light. So am I attracted to it? Do I want God's light to expose me? The darkness that's within me. If I don't want to be exposed, I can't be part of the process of helping the world be exposed by me being the light of the world. You can't put on display what you yourself haven't experienced. So we focus on being before we focus on doing. But that doesn't mean we don't focus on doing. We can neglect doing and also be in a very problematic situation, because that's actually what the end is focusing on, right? The end here is let your light shine. So you should be doing something, right? So we focus on our being, but so that we will have our doing as well. So how we live, thinking of salt, how we live our lives give people a certain flavor. Is there an attractiveness to the way that you live your life? Do people look at you and say, oh, they're very meek? Or, they're quite proud? Do they look and say, man, they seek peace? Or do they look and say, that person seems awfully bitter? You know, the State of the Union address happened. And I'm not saying a word about policies or the objective things that were said, but our president gives a really bad flavor of life. Right? I mean, regardless of the policies, right? I'm not talking about the policy, I'm not talking about the objective things, but the pride that comes, the I's and the me's, right? And the talking down at everybody else, right? That's a horrible flavor. I look at that and say, I hope my life tastes nothing like that. Right? So how we do, what we do, gives everybody around us a flavor of what life is supposed to look like. But also what we do exposes what is lacking for those who are in the darkness. This is light now, right? So as we seek to live a pure life, as we seek to forgive other people, as we seek to grieve our own sin, as we seek to live a righteous life, it shines into the darkness and says, look how different this is. It exposes all those who are walking in impurity, all those who don't care about their sin. Right? So as we live, it's an exposure that happens as well. So we want to focus on both. We want to grow in our being so that our doing these things will follow. And I want to just close with this reminder because it's a temptation from this passage. When it says, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven, we must not think that the word works means you never use words. Because that's the temptation. The temptation here would be to say, because it says works, it's only about what I do and it's never about what I say. And we've already clarified this from earlier in Jesus' ministry, all the way back in chapter 4 as his ministry began. What did Jesus do? He did good works, right? By healing people, those who were sick, those who had the demons, and Jesus proclaimed the gospel of the kingdom. He taught them about the gospel. In fact, Jesus is presently teaching with words. What we're studying right now in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' own words. So we can't say, looking at Jesus' example, it's just what you do. It's never about what you say. And I get why we think that, because all of us are afraid of not knowing the right thing to say in a moment. Right? I get it. I understand that. But we can't fall into the trap to say, oh, see, it says good works. That means I don't have to use my words. That's not at all what is being said here. In fact, Jesus is using words here, set an example and a precedent for us. So we must view words as part of good works, our words as part of our flourishing, our words as part of shining our light. So my friends, the question is quite simple to close our time. How is your flourishing being tasted and seen by the world around you? What flavor of life are you giving off to the people who taste your life? What kind of light are you shining to those who are seeing you? Are you exposing what darkness looks like? How is your flourishing being tasted and seen? Let's pray.